Hi everybody, we know that fiscal policy is a major hot topic area for paper 2, but when these questions come up in the exam, they're often themed to major events in the UK economy. So you guys need to be aware of what those themes are to make sure that you can use some of these stats and application in those essays, but also this context can help you weigh up arguments. It's very important that you're well in tune with these major themes, and I'm going to cover both major themes with fiscal policy for you today. So take everything in and make sure by the end you feel like an absolute master of fiscal policy. The first major theme is what happened in the UK during COVID times. We used heavy expansionary fiscal policy in both ways. Massive increases in government spending, massive tax cuts to try and drive our economy out of a major economic crisis. Let's focus on what the policies were. Well, on the government spending side, we saw a huge increase in healthcare spending, essentially a blank check policy to the NHS. Not surprising, it was a massive pandemic at the end of the day, but that increased government spending no end. We normally spend around 160, 170 billion pounds a year on the NHS. That doubled during the heart of the pandemic. We also had the furlough scheme, the government paying the wages of the employed and the self-employed despite no production of goods and services taking place, despite these workers doing nothing at all. Again, a massive increase in spending there. We also saw welfare spending go up. It was easier for people to claim universal credit, that's benefits in the UK, but also the amount people could claim increased during the heart of the COVID crisis. But also on the tax side, VAT was cut for industries hit hardest by the pandemic, leisure industries, hospitality, tourism industries. So VAT cut from 20% all the way down to 5%. And also these industries were exempt from paying business rates. Business rates are a tax on the value of business property, physical property. And it's quite burdensome, this tax on businesses. So in 2020, 2021, at the heart of the COVID crisis, business rates were taken away from those industries to help them out during the heart of the COVID crisis. So you can see very heavy fiscal stimulus, very heavy expansionary fiscal policy. For what intention? Well, for the exact intentions that you learn in the classroom, that you understand by now. Basically, to increase aggregate demand, to drive an economy out of recession, to close a negative output gap, to propel an economy towards recovery. That was the basic goal. It seems crazy to say it now, but deflation was a massive risk in 2020 especially. Inflation rates were regularly below 1%, threatening deflation. So yeah, to increase inflation, to avoid deflation, we know we get that if aggregate demand goes up. To keep unemployment low, to prevent a massive spike of unemployment. Unemployment in the UK peaked at 5.4% during the heart of the COVID crisis. It didn't get greater than that. You could argue these policies were quite successful in achieving that. And in terms of avoiding deflation, we didn't get deflation in the end, although we're now suffering from very stubborn higher than target rates of inflation. But we didn't get the deflationary concerns. We didn't get the spike in unemployment. You could argue policies like the furlough scheme, the wage subsidy scheme had a big part to play in that. And of course, the other intention to increase economic growth, to try and prevent a massive cliff edge fall in economic growth. Well, economic growth did fall substantially in 2020, an 11% contraction in the UK economy, but our recovery, 2021, 2022, was pretty strong. 2021, growth rates of around 7%, 2022, 4%, pretty decent strength of economic recovery. You could argue these policies had a part to play in that. So fine, the intentions are clear, the effects are pretty clear. On the positive side, yes, we could see some good effects, but we are now very much suffering from major concerns, side effects of this heavy expansionary fiscal policy, aren't we? Let's not ignore the inflationary impact of these policies. A lot of focus on the supply side drivers of inflation in the UK over the last year, but let's not forget the role of major expansionary demand side policies like the fiscal policies we saw during the COVID crisis, especially policies like the furlough scheme, massive injections of money into the economy with no direct increase in the production of goods and services. Of course, there is likely to be a strong inflationary impact from those policies. Demand pull inflation definitely increased. Before the war in Ukraine started, inflation was around 7% in the UK. So 100% the link to inflation has been very strong. We know inflation has peaked at more than 10% at the moment as we speak as well. So absolutely, that's a concern, a trade-off there. And the impact on government finances that these policies had. A huge deterioration, worsening of government finances that we are now battling with at the heart of the crisis. So in the fiscal year 2020 to 2021, a fiscal year in the UK is essentially from the start of April through to the start of April the following year. Our budget deficit 2020-2021 was 14.5% of GDP. So the amount that the government borrowed in that one fiscal year was the equivalent of £305 billion. In one fiscal year, our government borrowed that much money. To put that into context for you, the UK government has not borrowed that much since World War II. Very much war-like borrowing here. The fiscal year prior, 2019-2020, the government borrowed only £40 billion. So in the space of 1 year, an 8-fold increase in borrowing. Extraordinary. Go even further back to the financial crisis, where the government was doing all kinds of crazy stuff like bailing out banks. Our budget deficit peaked at around £100 billion in 2009-2010, that fiscal year. And at that time, the government had to justify what they were doing. It was an eye-watering sum of borrowing. And they said, well, this is a very unique event, like a once-in-a-lifetime event. We're not going to see borrowing like this for another generation. Well, 10 years later, we're talking of £305 billion as a budget deficit. Extraordinary. But even budget deficits the year after, 5.6% of GDP. This year, 6.1% of GDP. Stubbornly high budget deficits and very high national debts, peaking at over 100% of GDP as we're talking now. Our national debt is around 100% of GDP. So we are battling with a significant worsening of government finances. We're now in a very contractionary mindset with fiscal policy to deal with the horrible impacts on government finances. A great stat to write down. This year, 2023, our government is forecast to spend £116 billion just on servicing debt interest, just on paying debt interest, which is incredible. That's more than our government spends on any public service in the UK apart from the NHS. It's more than they spend on schools, for God's sake. Incredible to think about, isn't it? And now we know we're battling through higher taxes, cuts to other areas of government spending to deal with this, the burden on future generations. Everything we've learned in the classroom when we worsen government finances is happening right now in the UK. And in fact, that's our next theme, our current theme, very much contractionary fiscal policy to deal with this. So yes, the main way our government is going at the moment is with significant tax rises on the contractionary fiscal policy side. Big direct tax increases, most notably income tax is increasing. The Chancellor has committed to freezing the income tax bands in our progressive income tax system all the way to April 2028. Now, how is that a tax rise? Well, every year people's pay goes up, hopefully in line with inflation. Now, let's say that happens. Can you understand that in real terms, people aren't better off? Their pay is simply rising in line with inflation. Now, what should happen every year is that our income tax bands in the progressive income tax system should also rise in line with inflation. But if they're frozen like this policy is doing, then as people earn more simply in line with inflation, they could end up being dragged into higher income tax bands and thus pay higher rates of income tax. So actually, these workers could be worse off. This is a policy that hurts workers quite heavily, but is great news for the government. It increases their tax revenue considerably. So this policy alone, just freezing the income tax bands up to 2028, is expected to earn the government something like £27 billion a year more by 2026. That's an incredible increase in revenue by just freezing our income tax bands. It's insane to think about it. This phenomenon is known as fiscal drag. And this is very much fiscal drag on steroids, isn't it? Millions more people expected to be dragged into higher tax bands, around 2.6 million more in the 20% rate, around 3.4 million more in the 40% rate, millions more people into these higher tax bands. It's crazy, very much fiscal drag on steroids. Great news for the government, very, very bad news for workers. In fact, when this policy was initially announced, the government wasn't expecting inflation to be so high. But now that inflation is so high, the revenue gain for the government has increased exponentially, it feels like. But also, corporation tax is going up significantly. It's just gone up as of April of this year to 25% from 19%, a very significant direct tax rise. We've also had new windfall taxes, most notably a windfall tax on energy profits, mainly to fund policies like subsidies, grants, to give energy relief to households given the energy crisis that we've just gone through. So that's to fund those policies. But again, a nice revenue earner for the government. There have been some cuts in government spending, most notably cuts in welfare spending, and the policies that we saw during COVID times being reversed, but also other cuts to welfare spending as well. We've also seen reversals of the VAT cuts, the business rates exemptions as well. So that's the contractionary side we're in at the moment. And for the core goal of what? Well, to make sure inflation is tamed. You hear Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt talk about that all the time. They don't want fiscal policy to stoke inflation further. By using contractionary fiscal policy like this, it keeps a lid on further increases in AD and helps to control further rises in inflation. But I would say no, the core reason why the government is doing this is very much to deal with the mountain of COVID debt that we racked up during the heart of the COVID crisis. Absolutely use these policies to bring down our budget deficits, bring down the national debt, try and increase confidence in the state of government finances. We saw what happens if people lose confidence in the state of government finances. The end of September 2022, Kwasi Kwarteng, Liz Truss, that crazy mini budget. Look what happened when people lost confidence in government finances. Interest rates on government bonds, on government debt went through the roof. There was a meltdown of our economy, risk of government bankruptcy. So what the government is trying to do now is basically reverse those impacts by improving the stability, sustainability of government finances, promote more confidence in government finances, make sure the government is seen as a less risky borrower, so credit ratings on government bonds improve, so interest rates on government bonds can stay low, making it easier and cheaper for governments to borrow money over time and fund public services. That's the long-term goal that the government is hoping for with the use of these policies. But also you hear both Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt constantly talk about the need for fiscal headroom, i.e. flexibility, affordability for expansionary fiscal policy in our next crisis. They say if we have another shock in the economy, we need to fund expansionary fiscal policy. We need governments to be in a good way, a healthy way to be able to do that. So they're your major arguments. But what are the concerns of using such contractionary policies? Well, the main one is just the lower AD risk. These are contractionary policies at the end of the day. If they're significant, they can lower AD and potentially shock the economy back into recession. We know our forecast growth rate for this year is minus 0.2%. We are the only major advanced nation in the world to be using contractionary fiscal policy as well as contractionary monetary policy. No wonder we're forecast to shrink this year. We're already seeing this impact quite strongly. Fair enough point here. With lower growth, higher unemployment risks that come with it. At the same time, we're using these policies at the heart of a cost of living crisis. This will simply burden households even more. The cuts to welfare we talked about, but also these massive tax increases, especially the income tax rise, is not helping households out at a time where bills, inflation generally skyrocketing in the economy. And the risk of higher income inequality, especially the higher income tax, the freezing of the tax bands will hit those on lowest incomes the hardest, and cuts to welfare we've talked about can risk an increase in income inequality. But the government, especially on this major trade-off, number one, is saying that we are aware that these tax rises can be quite bad for macro performance in the UK, harming AD, reducing growth, increasing unemployment. So what they're saying is we're trying to balance out the negative impacts of these by increasing government spending more than we would have done otherwise. They've committed to spending £600 billion more over the next 5 years than they would have done originally on these areas in particular, to increase actual growth, so increase AD, short-run growth, but also you can see lots of these areas are supply-side areas. They're saying there could be an increase in potential growth, long-run growth in the UK as well. We are not seeing the fruits of these policies just now. We know our forecast growth rate is negative this year, but they're saying give it time. The next few years, we should see growth coming back in the UK. We need to wait and see. It doesn't look like this is offsetting that at the moment. Certainly these tax rises are damaging UK macro performance as we speak, but who knows over time if they're going to be correct. So that, guys, is all the major context you need with fiscal policy at the moment. Two major themes to be aware of. And imagine if you can sprinkle some of these stats, use this context to weigh up arguments in your essay, you are going to score the highest possible grades. And that's the point of this video. So I really hope you enjoyed it. You took it all down. We're going to do exactly the same for monetary policy coming next. Can't wait to see you in that video. Thanks for watching, guys.